Thank you. Stephen, you've written an amazing book.
Thank you.
It's extraordinary. But before we start talking about this current book, I just have to ask you, or let me start by telling you, when I first started reading your writing many decades ago, there was a joy as a theater practitioner that I had because you were a critic who brought history back into the reading of Shakespeare in a way that I could use on stage. And criticism, particularly the smartest criticism, had not done that previously. I had felt abandoned by the smartest people writing about Shakespeare. And suddenly you were using history in an imaginative, sometimes it was creative way that I don't even know quite how to describe it, but you were taking things that did not seem automatically to be connected, but putting it in reference to Shakespeare that brought the historical context of Shakespeare alive in a way that directly affected our practice, and I want to thank you for that.
It's incredibly kind of you, and as I think you understand, or I understand it to be paradoxical, because you would think that work that attempts to resituate artists who lived a long time ago, in this case, in their world, would be exactly of no use to a contemporary theater. And if I try to think of how that is possible, and I accept it as an extraordinary and gracious compliment, it has to do with the reverse, which is that for me, as the kind of training that I had was entirely about the text and thinking about the text, which I loved, but it was actually quite averse to thinking about performance. And because I love the theater, I obsessively went to the theater. I lived in England and studied for several years, and I would go to London on weekends and immerse myself in an astonishing moment in British theater, and then I've never stopped actually loving the theater. And it's as if thinking about real people, real bodies,
right.
Calculations of how to survive in a cutthroat commercial world, to figure out how to get by, that turned out to be crucial for me to try to go back into the history and understand what happened 400 years ago, 500 years ago. In the case of England, from the 1570s on, the first commercial mass public theater
right.
Since the ancient world. They invented this extraordinary thing, but only a few years before Shakespeare, Marlowe, a handful of others came on the scene, this extraordinary thing, and they had to figure out what to do with it.
Right. The description that you have in this book of the England that existed before Marlowe and before this is so potent, and an England that was behind the continent, an England that was far from being the leading light of the world intellectually and culturally, was clearly a backwater compared to what was happening in France and Italy.
It was a very strange, it would be a little bit, well, I may be exaggerating, but for someone who came from Rome, would be like going to Kazakhstan, that you think, really? That where am I? And people did say some version of where am I when they got to England. And that wasn't simply because England, though it was remote by European standards, but it was even more because it had been going through a nightmare of regime change back and forth since Henry VIII and onward. I mean, Henry VIII was an equal opportunity persecutor. He went after Catholics and Protestants that he didn't like, but it meant that after Henry VIII, who had already traumatized the country,
by taking them out of
by taking them out of Europe, it's a kind of Brexit before the letter, taking them out of participating in what they call the Corpus Christianorum, the body of all Christians across national boundaries, and then killing Thomas More, killing the best poet of the age, and people began to get frightened. And then following Henry VIII, there was a more radical Protestant regime that killed people, Catholics. Then there was a Catholic regime that killed Protestants. Then Elizabeth came to the throne, and though we have a kind of sweet vision of Elizabeth as
Queen Bess.
Yeah, Queen Bess. Actually, the killings abated slightly, but only slightly. And by the 1570s, which is, say when the theater emerged, everything was down. And whoops, this will fall on our heads.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, everyone was frightened. So there was no public space. There was no freedom of expression. There was no notion that you could, in your heart of hearts, believe whatever you really wanted to believe.
Right.
On the contrary, they would root out, if they possibly could, what you believed and try to make sure that it corresponded to what the state wanted you to believe. If you said things casually in the tavern, there were spies that would report you, and you could be in fantastic trouble. You could get your ears cut off, your nose slit, or worse could happen to you. So this is the world in which Christopher Marlowe, born in 1564, William Shakespeare, born in 1564, this is the world they came into, a world of fear, but also a world in which basically the country had fallen into two viciously opposed sides, with lots of variations but always with the emphasis on the vicious.
It's so interesting. I mean, I've spent obviously a lot of time with Shakespeare's work and reading about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's time, but the evocation that you make of the fear, of the dissension, of the polarization, of the backwardness of a country that had been locked in that kind of dispute for decades is so visceral.
I mean, imagine a world in which it's difficult for us perhaps to imagine a world in which you couldn't say what you wanted to say without getting in fantastic trouble. I know we don't have that.
It's impossible to imagine
any
that.
longer.
Where if you said something on TV that something would happen to you, couldn't imagine that.
Nothing. No, I mean, this is the situation. And in fact, the theater was this strange anomaly. It had existed, and in the 1570s they were putting on a set of plays that weren't risking very much, but Shakespeare, and before Shakespeare, Marlowe, figured out something about this peculiar space, which is that in a world of repression, there was this strange zone in which you might actually begin to experience something like freedom.
And these theaters, as you write in the book, these are the first freestanding theaters that had been built in England since Roman times for 2,000 years.
Exactly.
And why were they built? Why now did these theaters spring up?
I mean, the simple answer is money, of course.
To make money.
To make money. They were commercial enterprises. They were commercial enterprises that depended upon the fact that London's population had soared in the 16th century. So finally, you had a city with a very large population that made it possible. There had always been theater companies traveling around the country, performing in inn-yards and in halls, but there wasn't a stable population in a place where you could actually expect that on a given afternoon, because all of these plays were done in the afternoon, you could get a large number of people to take off from work and go to the public theater and have an afternoon at the public theater.
Right. And of course, there was also bear baiting and bull baiting. So there are other kinds of public entertainments in these arenas, and theater plays were added to that repertory.
A few of the theaters were used both for bull and bear baiting and for plays. Not all of them were, but we know this because Ben Jonson their contemporary, has a joke in one of the beginnings of his plays saying that it still smells like bear shit in the theater. I mean, so they would clean them out, but maybe not adequately.
But there's such a sense now of out of the mud and, violence. And I mean, this is not entertainment that we would find palatable. Out of this, these plays start to emerge. And just as, Shakespeare is a glover's son, Marlowe is a cobbler's son, but somehow Marlowe is also a scholarship boy that ends up going to Cambridge, learning Latin, and this is very unusual.
Very unusual, and more surprising in a way for Marlowe than it would have been for Shakespeare. Shakespeare's father was a glover, but he was a fancy glover who had served as effectively the mayor of Stratford, the bailiff. Marlowe's father was really trash. He was cited for beating his apprentice and drawing blood. His sister was cited for beating an old man up in the street. I mean, this was a rough family from a very miserable neighborhood in Canterbury, and for reasons we don't actually. My book, as you know, is chock full of speculation. For reasons I can speculate, this little boy of a very rough family managed to learn enough Latin to win acceptance to the very wonderful fancy school associated with the cathedral in Canterbury, and everything changed for him. I mean, as happens to maybe still in many families in our world too, where the going to college, going to school changes the whole class situation for the.
Right.
He escaped, if that's the right word for it. He was expected probably to work as a cobbler, and instead he goes to
the King's School,
and then he goes to Cambridge University. That's amazing.
And you speculate about this, but you write so beautifully about his relationship to Latin and what that must have been like and done to his mind.
Yeah, I mean, what it was. These schools they were conducted entirely in Latin. The grammar school that he went to, eventually Greek as well, but basically you were not allowed to speak a language other than Latin at the King's School, and same at Cambridge in the late 16th century. So you had total immersion in this ancient language that, of course, no one in your actual world outside spoke. No one in Marlowe's family would have understood a word of it. So he's immersed in this, and for most kids, it was a rather unpleasant. I should say kids, most males, because this was all male. It was a puberty rite, but an unpleasant puberty rite, largely associated with being beaten severely. Because actually, it's much easier to learn Latin, it turns out, if you're beaten a great deal. And there are even theories about this in the period that the buttocks were created to enable boys to learn the ablative absolute and so forth. But for Marlowe, it was a liberation. He also probably had a share of beatings, but it was something other than torture. It was an escape into a fantastic world of beauty, of freedom, of the violation of every rule with which he had been brought up, a kind of extraordinary adventure.
Because you make this wonderful point. Once you had burst through that barrier and learned Latin, this rigid, hidebound, dogmatic society, what you were reading in Latin was Ovid and Petrarch, were wildly non-dogmatic classical scholars.
Absolutely. They made in some way, crazy decision to give the kids not works of piety, but fabulous works of sexy poetry and crazy plays about whores and con men. And they did it because they understood that the Latin was fantastically beautiful in those works. That's the best Latin. And they recognized this. The schoolmasters recognized that there was a little problem, which is there's a gap between everything that they were trying to persuade the children to believe on the one hand, and the books that they were giving the children to read. And probably for most of the kids it didn't matter because it was such an unpleasant experience to learn the Latin, and they never quite got there and so forth. But for Marlowe, we know, because what does he do? He, on his own, decides to translate Ovid's Amores. That's Ovid's disreputable, sexy poems about adultery that hadn't been translated into English because they really weren't appropriate.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But then, actually, this isn't in the book, but when we were talking this morning, you made this comparison because what England is now doing is turning out people like Marlowe who have advanced degrees, not just an undergraduate, but a master's degree. But really the only job open to them is the clergy.
Yeah, that's why they picked poor boys and gave them scholarships, because the English church, the Church of England, needed bodies in parishes. They weren't going to pay them very much, and they found it difficult. They had disrupted and disbanded the Catholic clergy, and they needed educated clergymen, and they picked out these very bright, if they could get them, bright children of the poor, with the idea that they would become clergy. And in fact, we can track the kids in the school, and most of them did actually become clergymen in small parishes.
But our cobbler's son, who's translating Ovid, seems like a very poor candidate for the clergy.
The absolute worst candidate for the clergy ever invented. And he must have known that at a certain point. And yet, when he got his BA degree, he went on to apply for a further scholarship to get his MA degree. And that was clearly had to be heading for the clergy, for becoming a priest. It gave him an extra 3 years of immersing himself in Latin, enjoying whatever he was doing in Cambridge. But the state tried to make sure that kids of this kind couldn't do virtually anything else with a background like this. Very few of them managed, early in the century, very few of them managed to get into the basically government administration. But by the time Marlowe comes on the scene, there fundamentally are almost no jobs. So you can imagine, again, a very unfamiliar world, a world in which, let's say, you train a lot of PhD candidates in English and in history, and then you don't give them jobs at the end. There's nothing for them. So they feel increasingly enraged and alienated. And that's, again, the world of the 1580s.
And so you have young Marlowe. He's got this education. It's clear to us and to him he's not going to be in the clergy. But what he's going to do is not clear at all.
No, the idea that he might become a playwright may have occurred to him, but it's a wild and crazy idea when he comes on the scene. The theater it's the Wild West. It's just beginning. And we know something fascinating about what Marlowe did, in fact, do at that moment in his life when he had to make the decision. He put in these papers to get his MA degree at the end of 6 years at Cambridge. And a document was sent to him saying, no MA degree, we're not giving you a degree because you have not fulfilled the residence requirement. You were missing, you were absent for long periods of time, and you were required to be in residence, but you weren't. And it is rumored that you had gone to France to the English College, as it was called in the city of Reims, which was training clandestine Catholic priests to be smuggled back into England to serve the faithful Catholics. The country still possesses large numbers of secret Catholics, even though it's illegal, and possibly, if possible, to kill the Queen.
So this is essentially a school for revolutionaries.
For revolution. This is terrorists. From the point of view of the government, the Protestant government, these are terrorists. So Marlowe said the 3 years of work beyond the BA degree is for nothing. He's not going to get his degree. A month passes, and then a letter was sent to the Cambridge authorities. And the letter was signed by every important person in the Elizabethan state, short of the Queen. And it says that Her Majesty would be unhappy if someone who has done such important service to the state as this young man should not be given his degree. Give him his degree. And you know what? They gave him his degree. And
that's the historical evidence.
that's the historical evidence. The document survives. That letter survives. So what does the letter mean? The letter means, what important service was he doing? The letter means that as continues in some ways, the state trolled through Oxford and Cambridge to find potential spies for the spy service. And Marlowe was recruited, clearly, probably in his last year. I say probably in his last year because you can follow when he was in residence in Cambridge. Why? Because they kept track of, they had something called the Buttery books in which they kept track of his payments for beer and food, all the kids' payments, because they were required. Even the scholarship kids were required to keep track of how much they were eating and drinking. And we can tell when Marlowe wasn't there anymore.
See, this is what I mean about the way he uses history and documents. You know, the Buttery books, who would have thought?
Yeah. Well, I'm not the first person I confess to have thought of it. I mean, they're unbelievably difficult to read, partly because they kept spelling Marlowe's name in a different way. Marlowe, Merlin, Morley, Marley. I mean, whether he said it in different ways is not clear, but they couldn't get it right. Anyway, you can watch and see when he was there. And you can also see that when he came back from these mysterious long absences, he drank more beer and ate more food. He had more money in his pocket. So that's also quite interesting.
It tells us something.
Yeah.
So we don't have any other historical evidence about what he was doing there, except he went on absences, he had some money when he came back, and at this moment when his degree was denied him, the highest levels of government interfered and said that he'd done the state some service.
That's basically what we don't know the actual nature of the service. Marlowe is likely to have gone to France to probably pretend that he was a Catholic and enroll, possibly pick up secret documents and look around in the English college, report who was there. I mean, who knows what it was there. And you have to know that the consequences for the people who trusted him would have been hideous.
Severe.
Yeah. So this is not, how should we say, Marlowe, I'm sorry to say, is not a model citizen or an admirable moral agent. He's a complicated person in a very difficult situation in a world that is divided between factions that hate each other and want to kill each other.
And so here is this working class kid, scholarship boy, tremendously smart, clearly,
Yes.
becomes learned, has no fixed place in society, but is recruited to become a double agent, is recruited to become a professional liar, a professional spy.
Yes, to make up stories, as it were.
To make up stories. And then he starts thinking, maybe I can make a living writing these plays. And the first play, Dido, is a interesting, good,
Yes.
but not a moneymaker.
Not a moneymaker, and shows already early in his career. He would have written this when he was at Cambridge, a recklessness that follows him, of course, through his brief life and career. Dido, Queen of Carthage, begins with a scandalous scene of the god Jupiter with a little boy Ganymede on his lap. And Ganymede is the boy that Jupiter, Zeus, abducted to be his cupbearer. And you can read a big wink in cupbearer. And he's sitting on Jupiter's lap, and Jupiter says, I want a hug. I'll give you anything. What do you want? Do you want a brooch? Do you want some feathers from Venus's swans? What will it take for you to hug me? And I mean, that's the nature of the exchange. That's Marlowe saying, look, this is what we've been studying. This is what the ancient world is actually about. Yeah. And it remains actually even now. I don't know if you ever did Dido. No. It's not a wonderful play because it falls apart. It's very crude, but it has this outrageous opening scene.
So right from the beginning, he's doing something transgressive. He's saying, I'm going to put something out there that, if not quite going to get me arrested, but it's definitely pushing the boundaries.
Absolutely. And then
he does something extraordinary.
He comes to London. He must have already started started almost certainly in the Cambridge University Library. He found things that interested him, works written in Latin about a Mongol conqueror centuries earlier named Timur the Lame, Tamberlain, and he at some point early it must have occurred to him, I can do something with this material about a nobody, a shepherd's a shepherd, a absolutely poor, miserable character who conquers basically the known world by virtue of fantastic command of language and total ruthlessness.
Right.
And he comes to London with a play. We don't know, or at least with probably the beginning of a play, maybe further along. He makes connection with an entrepreneur, an extraordinary figure who was named Philip Henslow, who's running a new theater called The Rose. And we don't know how he makes the connection, but he gives the play to Henslow. He's just a kid, Marlowe, but Henslow sees, my God, and I know the perfect person to play the part of Tamberlain. He has a great actor named Ned Allen, and from there, everything changes. Everything changes for the English theater, as well as everything changes for Marlowe.
And one of the things, and again, this is reading this is as exciting as you can imagine. You talk about what he does with the verse line, because as Ben Jonson, Marlowe's mighty line. And if you could talk about that, because that sort of paves the way for what Shakespeare does with it.
I mean, the English in this period, and we're talking about, this is a commercial enterprise that had to draw 2,000 to 3,000 people in an afternoon away from work to spend the afternoon in the theater. And the civic authorities were horrified by this and kept wanting to shut the things down. But the theaters went on. And people talked about going to hear a play. We know that because from letters and from things. What play are you going to hear this afternoon? Not to see a play.
Yeah.
These are afternoon plays, no lighting, very little in the way of stage design, beautiful costumes, but above all, language. And the plays that had been on the stage up to Marlowe's time were written in verse largely, but in what was called Poulter's measure. And it sounds like the da 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 da. It's actually incredibly annoying to listen to for any length of time. And Marlowe came up with a new way of doing this, which was to write the plays in blank verse, as it was called, unrhymed iambic pentameter, 10-beat lines, unrhymed. And that actually turns out to be the way English, ordinary, eloquent English sounds like if it's a little bit on steroids. That is to say, it sounds like spoken English, unlike the Poulter's measure. It sounds like, because most of the way in which most English syllables work, but it's turned up a notch. So it was like the invention of the talkies or the invention of Technicolor, where things you had heard before suddenly seem more powerful, more exciting, reach you in a deeper way. And I mean, you will know, Oskar will know far better than I, what effect it is, how you get actors to grasp the power of the iambic pentameter.
Well, you've all experienced it when you watch a great actor play Shakespeare. There's something about those lines that are just thrilling. And it's because, exactly as you say, Stephen, it's like normal speech, but heightened. And then, because Shakespeare is really just on Marlowe's tail. He's like 3 years behind Marlowe. And what Shakespeare starts discovering, and we've been taking advantage of ever since, is that with this verse, you can pack an enormous amount of information and people can follow it. If you tried to put as much information into prose as Shakespeare puts, or Marlowe, puts into the verse, you'd be hopelessly lost in the audience. But because it's in that driving, ba-ba, 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 you can remember it. somebody else who figured out how to do that was Lin-Manuel Miranda, because you can have the same thing in Hamilton. And one of the reasons that Hamilton is so thrilling is, again, you've got 10 times the amount of just information as in a normal musical, and somehow you don't have the same problem retaining it and understanding it as you would if it were not rhythmically working in your mind.
Absolutely. I mean, and in the case of well, for both Marlowe and Shakespeare, they figured out ways in which they could do something that seems impossible, except that actually Americans have been very good at this. American artists have been very good at this. How is it possible to reach both the the fanciest people in the audience, the ones who've had, the very full education all the way through the advanced control of Latin and Greek and language, and the people who have nothing, who are standing in the...
Who are illiterate.
Who are illiterate. So how do you please both of them? Now, as they say, that is, after all, we're geniuses at this, and that's what The Godfather is about. That's what Breaking Bad is about. We have entertainments that actually cross these boundaries. But Marlowe and Shakespeare are the first artists. Marlowe is the first artist who basically figures out how to do this.
And he writes this play about this great conqueror, and is not really a very morality-based fable.
On the contrary. I mean, you keep expecting, everything written before Marlowe suggests that this kind of noisy, obnoxious, murderous character will get his comeuppance. And Tamberlain, Marlowe, has a character exactly of this kind. He kills everyone who comes anywhere near him, including his son, one of his sons, at this, and nothing happens to him. Goes on from one success to another, and eventually, sort of gets to marry the princess, the daughter of the Egyptian king, whom he's abducted, and she falls in love with him, as in a bad film noir. And I mean, nothing happens to him.
Just sort of imagine Scarface, where Scarface just keeps winning and winning and winning until the end.
Yeah, and in fact, the play was so successful that Marlowe was clearly pressured to write a second part, which he did. And at the end of the second part, Tamberlain does die. But he dies because he gets sick, and he was old. I mean, that's why you die. Nothing else happens to him for all the hideous things that he does. On the contrary, he goes from one heroic success based on bloodletting to another. And it's a kind of slap at the morality of Marlowe's world, at everything that everyone said about respect for authority, the God-given right of kings, the fact that if you are too arrogant, you will be punished, and so forth and so on. Every bit of it is toppled.
And the audience went for it.
They went wild. We know that they went wild because actually, one of the interesting things is in the wake of the performances of Tamberlain, if you go through the records, the birth records, not simply in London, but actually in the provinces as well, a weird number of children are named Tamberlain for this period, and then it stops. I mean, but there's a vogue for calling your kid Tamberlain,
and it's so interesting. Yeah. You can almost see that somehow the invention of, as Ben Jonson said, Marlowe's mighty line, the invention of that iambic pentameter, the putting it in the mouth of this heathen conqueror who is not amoral, immoral, and yet celebrating this play, the audience thrilling to it, it's all creating this kind of rupture in the theocracy of England.
Yes, and then there's a kind of artistic question for Marlowe afterwards, is what follows this? What if you're going to keep writing plays, what do you do? Do you write another play about another tremendous conqueror? Do you go on with more bloodshed? And you can see that the bloodshed was interesting. Shakespeare, who was watching, as Oskar says, who was watching Marlowe, does go on to write Titus Andronicus and see, you want bloodshed? I'll give you a tremendous amount of bloodshed. I mean, that so you can,
which was tremendously popular too in his time.
You can see that. But Marlowe, like Shakespeare, has to figure out, I'm not going to do this again and again and again. So Marlowe goes on to write a succession of plays, each of which seems completely different from the last one. I mean, even though they're using the same technology of the mighty line, of the beautiful line, but the Jew of Malta, Edward II, each of these is and then of course the greatest of Marlowe's plays, Dr. Faustus.
You know, and I'm going to talk for just a second. When you read this book, one of the things that you'll see is that Stephen weaves this sort of net of thinking between the plays, the analysis of the play, the history, and an implied narrative of Marlowe's life that is both absolutely plausible as a biographical narrative, but more importantly, it's an artistic creation in its own right. It's a storytelling about how modernity came to England and English literature that is thrilling in its own right to read. And I mean,
this is an incredibly generous way of Oskar saying I'm making it all up.
He does make up a lot, but but that's what we want, right? I mean, stories. That's what stories do. They tell things that could be true, and actually feel truer than just facts, because they're actually telling deeper truths.
Well, and there are damn few facts, and my only claim is that I use the word might and could have quite a lot.
No, you're actually quite clear about what is factual and what is speculating. You never confuse those two. But it is so fun to find. We've got to go to questions in a minute, but I need you to talk about Dr. Faustus just a bit, and particularly because you have what I think is actually a quite provocative and gorgeous speculation about Faustus and Marlowe's biography.
So Dr. Faustus, as you will know, is about a scholar who has spent his life, or has reached a point, having studied law, medicine, theology. He's reached a point in which he feels he can't go on. He's reached the end, as he keeps saying, of each of these. And he makes the decision, the fateful decision, to make a deal with the devil, to conjure the devil in exchange for what? He's dreaming that he'll do something for his country, he says. He's going to wall his country with brass against its enemies. He also dreams that he'll get knowledge that he's been craving, knowledge about the universe, knowledge about the world that is just outside his grasp. And he dreams that he's going to get a lot of sex. He's going to get pleasure, enormous pleasure. And he does actually get basically some versions of those things, except he doesn't really do very much for his country. He gets the right to slap the Pope across the face. But that's not a lot. What he knows as his life unfolds is that he will suffer the consequences of making the deal with the devil, that there'll be a limited amount of time. I mean, there's a limited amount of time for all of us, but he knows that at the end of this, he will be torn apart. He will have to go to the devil. And he feels this noose tightening around his neck. And what I do, it's an amazing play. There's nothing like it in English literature before. And Marlowe did something unexpected with this incredible, noisy, mighty line, which is he found ways of making it quiet. He in effect invented the soliloquy, the inwardness, in which a character reveals something of the torments that are only going on deep inside himself. Again, Shakespeare listening in the side, listening to learning how this can be done. And where does this come from? Where does this amazing achievement come from? So I do argue in my book that Marlowe is grappling with, coming to terms with, as best he can, with what happened to him, what he did when he was in his early 20s. He's still only in his 20s, but years before at Cambridge, and at what is happening to him now in London and what lies ahead of him, which he knows, he senses, is not going to be a happy end. Even as he is doing amazing things. He's in the circle of the most exciting and interesting people in England. Sir Walter Raleigh, the Wizard Earl, the 9th Earl of Northumberland, Lord Strange, these fantastic people whom I try to invoke in the book, who we know that Marlowe is in their circles. This nobody, this cobbler's son, is with one of the most important earls of England, one of the most powerful figures in the case of Raleigh in England, with scholars and scientists and adventurers. But he knows that the noose is slowly tightening.
And the story of his death is extraordinary. The mystery of his death is extraordinary. And like discussing any good mystery novel, we're not going to give it away here, but it's extraordinary. The thing that about Faustus that just twists in me is he has these grand dreams of what's going to happen when he sells his soul to the devil and Mephistopheles becomes his aide. And he ends up doing conjuring tricks. And
for wealthy people, powerful people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so small and petty what he ends up doing. He's like, all the grandeur is gone. And it's like having sold his soul, there's actually nothing left of those ambitions. There's nothing big left. It's brilliant.
It is. Insofar as it does represent, it's hard to say. Of course, we have only the evidence of the play and of Marlowe's life. But insofar as it is Marlowe burrowing into what he did to himself, it suggests that at a certain point he understood what he was being valued for by Sir Walter Raleigh, by the 9th Earl, how they were regarding him. This extraordinarily brilliant, very daring, very talented cobbler's son in the midst of these people.
We got a few minutes if anybody wants to make a question. I would just urge you to actually ask questions rather than statements. Yes?
It's a magnificent book, as great as Hamlet in Purgatory or The Swerve, which is saying a lot. Why is Tamberlain so rarely performed? And second, is it cynicism all the way down in this man? Or is there underneath his spycraft and his hedonism and his atheism some kind of hidden ethical passion buried beneath all that shines through like gold?
Yeah, there are two, thank you for the compliment, there are two wonderful questions. Tamberlain, I've only seen Tamberlain once at the Theatre for New Audience with a stupendous performance, actually, by John Douglas Thompson as Tamberlain, just an astonishing performance. But I think I loved seeing it, but I also think I understood why it isn't done all that often. It is a obsessively repetitive play. You watch Marlowe kill the virgins of Damascus, and then you watch him kill the virgins of another town, and then you watch him. I mean, it's as if Marlowe keeps rehearsing this phenomenon over and over and over again, and he finds absolutely astonishing language in which to do it. But I think it took an actor of John Douglas Thompson's magnificence to be able to carry through the language of the play, really, and through his physical presence, to carry the force of this enormous play so that you didn't finally get enraged by it and want to check out. So that I think is the case. In the case of the cynicism all the way down, I'm not sure there's it's a deep question, and I'm not sure there's an ethical answer to it, but I think there's an erotic answer to it, let's put it that way. Marlowe was almost certainly homosexual in a world that in which lots of people were, as they are, but in which it was extremely it was forbidden to be very open about it. There was a kind of don't ask, don't tell world in 16th century England. And I think he's continually coming up against the desire to say, look, this is a form of love that is as good as the forms of love that you are celebrating in your culture. The way he says it, and it's characteristic of Marlowe, to say it in a crazy way that's so dangerous. He's reported, at least, of saying that Jesus and John were lovers, and that Jesus used John after the manner, he says, of Sodom. Now, you didn't say that if you wanted to live a long life in the late 16th century, but I think that buried in that provocation is a sense that this is a form of love that the highest vision of my world should be able to accept. So that's part of the answer. And the other part of my answer would be that it has to do with whatever we think of disbelief. Marlowe, it's clear from the police reports that were written about him before his murder at the age of 29, the police reports all come back to the fact that he's calling into question the fundamental religious beliefs of his world. At the same time that he's playing games with it. But he says that Moses was but a juggler, that the Hebrews were ignorant and were tricked by Moses, who was good at magic tricks, into believing in these ridiculous stories. That the Eucharist would be better if it was smoked in a tobacco pipe. He makes all kinds of, makes remarks again that you don't make. But behind it is a sense of, if I don't believe the central ideological myths of my culture, and I'm living in a world in which I'm not supposed to say anything, what can I do? How can I say, you're living a lie? You can break out of this. You can actually escape from these stories. So is that an ethical position? It's a dangerous position, and it's out at the edge. And maybe for Marlowe, it had something like, I want to tell the truth in a world in which I'm not allowed to tell the truth. But he paid the price for it, if that's what it was.
Yeah, Rock.
If I can be allowed an observation and a question. Following up on Oscar's observation, and this is one of the ways you are special as a scholar, you're interested not only in the work but its relationship to the times, to the larger cultural and historical currents at any time. And Oskar referred to Marlowe and the advent of modernity. And you're interested in all of that historical context, as Oskar says. And you're interested in not only how the Times creates the work of literature, but how the literature creates the Times. Or in the case of the swerve, the discovery of literature can change the Times and create the Times. That is one of the ways that you're special. Another way is the deeply personal nature of your scholarship. You begin the swerve with deeply personal recollection of your childhood. There's this is in the Marlowe book too. And I wonder if you could elaborate on your own personal connection to this material, what it is about you personally in your life that drew you to tell this story and to examine this work.
I don't have a wonderful question. I have less of a formulated answer to that, except that at the very beginning of my career, such as it is, I back in the 1970s, I wrote about Marlowe. Marlowe, I said, as the master of absolute play, of radical playfulness. I knew nothing about the historical world that this came from. I just wanted to celebrate this crazy it was the 1970s. I wanted to celebrate this fantastic, mad liberation that Marlowe seemed to embody. And we're not in the 1970s anymore, and I'm not what I was then. I've reached a very different moment in my life in which, to some extent, I'm looking back and thinking, where actually did this astonishing thing come from? What rose up? How could it possibly have risen up? It wasn't absolute play. It was something else. I mean, there isn't such a it was that moment of the Becks or of the Living Theater. It wasn't the Living Theater. It was something else. And I tried to use everything that I've tried to understand and study over the subsequent 50 years, God help me, to try to reconstruct where this thing that I've been obsessed with my whole life that seemed to me such a kind of shock when I was in my 20s and 30s, where this actually came from. How could I explain it? And how could I won't say come to terms with it, but find myself in relationship to it. So that's the best I can do.
Yes, firstly, I want to thank you for your recent op-ed in the New York Times. I think we need a lot more academics and scholars fearlessly speaking out, as you did.
Thank you.
Quick question. My understanding is Elizabethan London grew from about 100,000 to about 300,000 in terms of population.
It managed to exceed Naples, which had been the largest city in Europe, as probably by demographic figures are hard to be sure about, but by the 1600, it was an immense city. And if you take the conurbation, huge.
And what would you estimate was like the theater population in terms of people who professionally worked in the theater at that time?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, because and a difficult question to answer because you have on the one hand the relatively small number of people who are actually members of the theater companies, like Shakespeare's company, who are shareholders in the company. There we have, a dozen, 15 people. But then they employ lots of apprentices. They hire people as extras. They actually kidnap children in this period. The cases come up repeatedly. If the children seem gifted as actors, it's a little like Pinocchio. I mean, where they
We still do.
Yeah. And so there you get a larger number of people, but it's unstable. The numbers keep shifting. So I think on the whole, you're talking about a relatively small number of people who are fully engaged in full-time in the theater, as someone like Marlowe was not full-time. Shakespeare is very unusual in having a total immersion in the theater, but I think you're talking about a relatively small number of people. Maybe if you added it all up together, not much more than 100, 120 maybe maximum. And that's also because the theaters keep getting shut down during plague, and they have to go traveling to try to survive. And they have to get what they can into a couple of wagons and go out on the roads. That you can't have large companies. Oskar will know maybe more about this than I.
No, but that sounds exactly right to me. It's what I've always assumed. From doing the plays, you keep feeling that Shakespeare's company was about 18 actors within people who held spears, but you need 18 actors to cover with doubling all the roles. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the personal relationship between Shakespeare and Marlowe?
Yes, it is quite fascinating. I mean, to me, quite fascinating. It has been said that we have no hard evidence, so that maybe they never met. I think that's wildly unlikely. And like a French farce, as I say, in which one of them went out the door and the other one walked in. This is, as we've just said, a relatively small world in which they almost certainly had to know each other. But in addition to that, it's now, I think, widely accepted by scholars that the second and third parts of Henry VI, that early tetralogy by Shakespeare, attributed to Shakespeare and included in the first folio, were written by Marlowe and Shakespeare. Shakespeare probably wrote much of it, maybe the majority of it, and Shakespeare gets his name on it. But the new editors of the Oxford Shakespeare call Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 plays by Shakespeare and Marlowe. And there's lots of philological evidence for that, lots of literary evidence for that. That's not what you're asking. And then we get into the interesting territory. What was the relationship actually like? Shakespeare was married with 3 kids back in Stratford-upon-Avon. Marlowe was definitely not married. And Shakespeare was the son of the former mayor of Stratford, but also hadn't gone to university. Marlowe has a BA and an MA from Cambridge. So there's lots of both parallels and profound differences. And in my book, how should we say, I try to stay fairly close to the actual evidence, but I allowed myself in my book the delicious fantasizing of what the conversations between the two of them were like when, as I think probably happened, Henslowe took Marlowe, Henslowe, the theatrical producer, said, look, I want a play based on English history, and I've got someone who's going to write it, but I want you to be in the writer's room too. And he brought him in, and Marlowe discovered that he was in the room with Shakespeare to write these plays together. And then I imagine Marlowe doing his thing. Well, do you actually believe most of this stuff about God and Queen Elizabeth? I mean, do we actually think that this is true? And don't you think that Earl of Southampton is a cutie pie? Wasn't he really incredibly handsome? I think I do it rather better in my book, but I'm doing it crudely here. And then Shakespeare finding ways to parry and avoid. Shakespeare made an incredible career out of staying out of prison and keeping it alive, which Marlowe clearly didn't. And I think of Shakespeare as finding ways to avoid. Marlowe was a trained secret agent. He was good at this, at bringing out people's secrets. Shakespeare comes from a family with lots of hidden Catholicism in it, and lots of things and I think Shakespeare is almost certainly bisexual as well. So Shakespeare could have entered into these conversations, but I think he didn't. And I think that John Aubrey, who was a collector of gossip in the 17th century after Shakespeare and Marlowe were both dead, but when there were people still alive who knew Shakespeare, he tried to find out what he could find about Shakespeare, and he was told by one person who knew Shakespeare or was close enough that Shakespeare was not a company keeper, he was told. When invited out for a debauch, he writes, Shakespeare said he was feeling sick, he had a headache. And I think that is actually probably true, that Shakespeare figured out ways of escaping this kind of danger. The interesting thing about Shakespeare in this regard is it wasn't that he was simply a coward. This is a playwright who has a character say, it's a heretic that makes the fire, not she that burns in it. Or has a character say, a dog's obeyed in office. But he found a way of saying this and keeping his head.
I want to thank Stephen for being here, and you for being here.